Okay, I just did it. So please know that this is being recorded. And first of all, I want to say good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of the counseling department and the counseling students at Springfield College, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone responsible for bringing S.E.A.T Week to life and allowing us to have these important, timely discussions. My name is Allie Burdick, and Counselors for Social Justice is proud to host this panel discussion on exploring racial trauma and Black mental health. At this time, I invite our experts to introduce themselves and to share with our audience who they are, what their background is, and a short synopsis including their definition of racial trauma and the current state of Black mental health as they experience it, either personally or with clients and students. After these introductions, we will open it up for questions from our attendees. So you can either use the hand raise button or we'll try to do it in some sort of organized fashion. So without further ado, we'll have Dr. Angie Cartwright start first, and hopefully won't have any technical problems.
Well, hello. I'll say good afternoon. It's afternoon where you are. It is still morning in Texas. So that means I still get to have one more cup of coffee. My name is Angie Cartwright, and I'm an associate professor at the University of North Texas, specifically an associate professor of counseling. I shared with some of the folks earlier that I'm having a few internet connectivity issues today, so I'm hoping that you all will be able to extend grace if anything happens with my connection. A little bit about the work that I do. I am a business owner, so I own my own counseling practice. It's North Texas Counseling and Wellness. At NTCW, we do counseling, supervision, and specifically we focus on communities of color, and more specifically, the Black community. Open. So at the University of North Texas, my research interest is centered on the Black community and mental health. I am the current president of the International Association for Addiction and Offender Counseling, and so I do have some specialty areas working with offender and addiction populations as well, and mentorship in counselor education and in the Black community. So that's just a little bit about what I do professionally, but I think my most important identity is being a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a friend. And so oftentimes when we interact in these spaces, we get to know about each other professionally, and sometimes that personal piece is left out. I tell folks all the time, the important part of the work that I do is really being a mom and being a daughter and being a sister. So I'd like for you all to know those intersections of my identity as well. Racial trauma is my definition of racial trauma is a compounding cumulative impact of oppression, discrimination, systemic oppression, sometimes overt and sometimes covert. I think racial trauma has both physical and mental health impacts, and a lot of those things intersect and intertwine, and it's hard to separate them out.
There's the same practice.
There's also educational impacts of racial trauma and economic impacts of racial trauma. And then I'm not sure if it's okay. I think we're good. So the cumulative impact of racial trauma, I think it is really just systemic oppression, covert and overt oppression, discrimination, and that just compounds depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and then physical ailments as well. So when we think about physical ailments, oftentimes we forget about the mental health component. Where we are as a society, and more specifically Black folks, I think that we are tired, we're hurting, we're angry, we're aware, and so all of those things compound, especially in today's political climate, and it can be a disaster, or it could be something that that becomes this beautiful way for us to advocate. I think one of the reasons why I'm so excited about being here with you all today is because we know, based on history, that young folks, more specifically folks in higher education settings, are the ones who really spearhead advocacy efforts. And so I'm really excited to be here and very thankful to share things with you this morning. And I guess I will pass it along to one of my colleagues. I'll pass it on to Dr. Hammonds.
Thank you, Dr. Cartwright. What a wonderful, I'm so excited to be here with all of you today for the same reason, speaking with young folks in the room on this call who are aware of these issues and are energized around them. So just a little bit about me. I am an assistant professor at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, where I think it's a little chillier, perhaps, but I know y'all are up north, so I don't know, we can't have a chilly competition today, but I really enjoy my work there because I'm able to meld all of the identities that are important to me in my work. So I teach, I supervise clinically. I also have a small private practice where I work with folks providing clinical supervision, but also seeing clients, and a number of them actually coming in and talking about these very issues right now. So that's some of what I'll touch on later on today. I also really enjoy doing this type of work. One of my goals has been mainstreaming mental health, and it's through these types of events. It's through getting out in the community. It's through touching and seeing people who are energized around the work that I do that I'm able to use a combination of my skill sets, my scholarship, and my clinical skills to get out the message and talk with you all. So that's really why I'm excited. I'm energized by being here, but also hopefully you can take something from our discussion today that will be like a seed that you can continue to cultivate and use in your own individual lives as you move forward. So I really enjoyed, and I think Dr. Cartwright gave us a solid definition of race-based trauma. And the one thing that I'd like to add to her definition is the importance to highlight that race-based trauma can be individual, systemic, or vicarious. And our group, actually, the four of us, have spent a lot of time talking about that vicarious trauma and how you may not individually have experienced racism, or you may not have experienced that overt racism, but what you do experience, or what often happens, is you just move throughout daily life and you hear these stories, you see things on television, you watch the news, you scroll through that Facebook or social media feed, and you're constantly inundated with example after example after example after example of something happening to someone who has similar characteristics to you. And that can be, I'm going to take that back, y'all. Not that it can't, it is exhausting, right? I think this group can handle that. It is exhausting. And that, frankly, is what my clients keep coming in talking about. I can't be myself at work. I'm recognizing that I have to put on a face, or these people around me know what's going on, but why don't they care as much as me? They get to just pretend like it doesn't exist, and I have to wear that all the time, and I don't get to take it off like a coat, right? It is part of me, and they just expect me to do my work and go on like nothing's happening. Well, it is, right? And there's anger and exhaustion and a level of, just a level of, I'm done. I don't know a better way to say that I keep hearing, and really sitting with clients around that. How do you still maintain yourself, really? How do you be you in all these environments, recognizing that it feels like the world is crumbling around you? And so that's what I've been talking about. Anything to add there? I think that speaking specifically about current state of Black mental health, I took notes on a couple of things that I'm seeing in addition to the stories that I just shared. I think that lack of control is also something that I tend to see, where it feels like you can't really get your arms around all of the experiences that are happening around you. And quite frankly, it's tiring to do that. So it just feels like you kind of have to give up control, and that feels disempowering. So how can you, this is the question that I continually come back to with my clients, but how can you maintain control? How can you feel empowered even though the world feels like it is taking every step to disempower you, to devalue you? Right? And then lastly, a lack of trust of those around you, the systems that are in place, because for some people that I've worked with, it felt like, yeah, you know, they can acknowledge that these things were lurking under the surface all along, but perhaps 2020 in all of its glory and the number of things that have happened this year have just ripped the cover off that. Like, we knew this stuff was happening, but right now it's so salient, it's in our faces, and coming into contact with that is really difficult. In addition, some of my clients are recognizing that their friends or people that they work with are also coming into contact with that. So whether they share those similar experiences or not, they're now having to manage other people's experiences who are realizing, oh, wow, I'm starting to get it. This is what you mean when. And then like, how, it's like, how do I manage my own stuff when you're coming to me talking about how you're feeling about this? I can barely hold it together. So there's so many things that are salient right now with just that one bullet point about the current state of Black mental health. So I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to pass it to the next person.
Okay.
I guess you want to go, Dr. Crumb?
Sure. Well, I've already taken on about a half a page of notes based on what my colleagues have shared. I am Dr. Loni Crumb. I'm assistant professor in the counselor education program at East Carolina University. East Carolina University is a medium-sized university on the East Coast of North Carolina, and I want to extend my gratitude to Springfield College and the Counselors for Social Justice organization for allowing us to be on this panel. And I ask everyone to think about this as a brave space. We've heard of safe spaces, but we know brave spaces is where everyone feels encouraged and supported to let their voices be heard by one another in a very respectful manner. I am very privileged to be here, and I am also a licensed professional counselor supervisor. And a lot of my work is spent in rural prosperity, rural mental health, quite recently on traumatic secondary stress and racial trauma and how it impacts rural youth, particularly youth of color who are in majority white spaces. This is what we see in rural areas, and making sure that our counselors are equipped with the tools for advocacy and not siding with silence, because we know that silence is siding with the oppressor. And the impacts of this secondary stress when our youth, particularly elementary school ages, middle ages, and even some high school students, they may not directly experience the police brutality, but they're watching social media 24/7 almost. And they are highly impacted by what they're seeing. Not only that, I've recently brought attention to the trauma that kids experience when their parents are directly experiencing police brutality and even killed in front of, by the hands of officers, and they're in the car, which has happened numerous times. So really bringing attention to that mental health and the long-term trauma their adverse childhood experiences, and basically how that exacerbates that and can last a lifetime. So a lot of my work is based right now in school-based mental health. And I will pass this now to Dr. Avent Harris.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janee Avent Harris, and like Dr. Crumb, I am an assistant professor in counselor education program at East Carolina University. I also serve as the program coordinator for our counselor education program. Really excited to be here. Thank you all for the invitation to invite us, and for the opportunity, I think, to like Dr. Crumb said, have a brave space where we can talk. A lot of my research is about mental health in Black communities, specifically with an emphasis on how spirituality and religion impacts mental health, impacts help seeking, impacts attitudes towards mental health and help seeking. And so while I spend a lot of my time, I think in the academic world, I also spend a lot of my time with churches, doing trainings, doing consulting, and just talking to people about what it would, particularly pastors, what would it look like to have these worlds be more merged so that we can increase access and so that counselors can learn how to be more culturally responsive in those areas. And so that's been a passion of mine for years. I grew up a church girl. I grew up hearing mixed messages about counseling, seeking help. So it's really been a passion of mine to do that. I think like what Dr. Cartwright says, like particularly when you do a lot of qualitative research, you don't exactly separate yourself from the work that you do. And so in the last couple of weeks or last couple of months, years, I found myself moving towards more specifically Black women's experiences. And what that looks like as far as mental health and in regards to a spiritual and religious lens. So that's kind of where I am now. If you notice, I am very out of breath already. And so my colleagues know, but I am 38 weeks pregnant. So at any time I can just give out of breath. So bear with me if you hear me breathing hard. I'm sorry.
Or anytime she could have this baby online.
So we're going to keep it interesting today. Anyway, all of that to say, I think my colleagues have given a really great foundation of what racial trauma is. And so I don't want to belabor or repeat. I think it's also important to note that there is no quote unquote diagnosis for that. And so it may come in your office looking like depression, looking like anxiety, of course, looking like PTSD. The thing is, if we don't talk about it, if we don't bring it into the room, we could attribute to a lot of different things. And so my clinical work has been primarily with college students, particularly at predominantly white institutions. So I see a lot of Black women at predominantly white institutions. And what I have found is that they find themselves in this place that is isolating, trying to find community, trying to seek out community, trying to navigate a world that wasn't necessarily built for them, if that makes sense, a system that was not built for them, while maintaining their identity, while maintaining their authenticity. And so that can be very difficult at times. So they often come to me with anxiety, with depression. I think overall, mental health in Black communities right now, to sum it up, it's just hard. Like, it's just difficult to navigate the different spaces we find ourselves in. I think COVID exposed a lot of systemic racism, systemic disparities that maybe had gone below the surface a little bit before. And even as you think about mental health, so more Black people, well, the disproportionate rates of Black people who have died from COVID, right? So you have now this racism, you have bias, you have COVID, but you also have this disproportionate proximity to grief and loss and what that looks like in communities. And in many ways, the primary coping mechanism that we've traditionally had being church has been taken away too in many ways. And so I think it's just like a lot going on, but I'm glad to be having this conversation because I think awareness does help, and it's a starting point to move toward action. So I won't take up too much more time because we really want to hear from you all and see what questions we can answer. But again, thank you so much for having us. And as a point of advocate, well, as a point of just kind of background, you know, one of the things about advocacy is that it can seem overwhelming. I know when I was a master's student, I was like, how am I going to ever be an advocate? Like, what does that look like? But this whole panel, our group coming together, literally came from a group chat that we were having. We was like, oh, what if we did X, Y, and Z? So, you know, I'm from church, so we say, don't despise small beginnings where you think you have an idea or you connect with a person and you say, what if we did X, Y, Z? Because there's a lot of work that can be done from just collaboration, from community, from networking. So I did want to say that too. So we'll toss it back to the host.
Thank you all so much for that. And congratulations, Dr. Avent Harris. I did not know you were 38 weeks pregnant. You better buckle up. I'm a mother of two, so.
This is my second one, so I'm like, okay.
Oh, so you kind of know.
A little bit,
but yeah, so many important points, and I love small beginnings. You have to start somewhere, and that's why I said I'm so grateful to everyone that put together this whole week, and you know, for our counselors for social justice for reaching out, and for all of you to being open to coming and sharing your knowledge and perspective and experiences with us. So thank you so much. And at this time, I'm going to open it up to questions. And if you can just use the hand raise tool, and we will try to get to everyone's questions that way. I know we also had some people that sent in questions previous to this morning. So we will definitely try to get to all of them. So.
I have a question. So something the last speaker alluded to, that there's no true diagnosis for racial trauma in the DSM-5. So I feel as if that when people are experiencing racial trauma, that we piece, well, they're depressed or they're anxious or they're this or they're that, but nothing truly affects, I mean, nothing truly speaks to what their affliction is. So my question is, do you think perhaps the DSM should include a clinical diagnosis of racial trauma? It's like any other trauma, and that can be answered by anybody.
That is a great question. I'd venture to say that we all have answers for that, and because we are so, I think because we're so linked professionally and personally, perhaps our answers may sound the same with a few nuanced differences. So the first part of your question, Katrina, should there be diagnostic criteria in the DSM for race-based trauma? Most definitely, absolutely. I could not agree with you more that there definitely should be some criteria there. Will I think that will actually happen? I don't think it will anytime soon. Maybe, but I would venture to say not. It takes so much, I think, to get diagnostic criteria into the DSM. I would say that the folks who draft and construct the DSM are psychologists. I believe with the last review, there was not even a counselor on their board to review the DSM. I do think, however, that there have been many struggles, and not to take this away from race-based trauma, but just as an example, with getting things into the DSM. There are, for example, sex addiction. It took so much work to even get recognition, and there have been so many foundational ground studies about sex addiction, and it really, I believe it's political in a lot of ways, and I think it's also very unfortunate that we still use the DSM. I think there are definitely some drawbacks and there are some benefits when you look at most countries and you look at things internationally. The ICD codes are more widely used, and so my question for us to ponder and for us to think about is why do we have to be different? Like, why do we need a DSM? It's not used in other countries. And so not that I am a conspiracy theorist kind of person, but maybe I am. I think a lot of it is for money. A lot of it is to differentiate us from others, and sometimes being different doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing. And so I'm not sure if my colleagues have anything else they'd like to add to that, but that would be my response in a nutshell. Most definitely, it should be added to the DSM, but I am not going to hold my breath that it actually happens.
Thank you.
And, you know, I would just add that before I even think we get to a conversation about diagnoses, it's like we have to have a hard look at our own profession and how we even think about conceptualization of some of these issues, and how do we not turn it into a blame game of the person or assigning paranoia to that person. Because, I mean, just to say this very bluntly, but some counselors don't believe racism exists. And so getting our profession to a place where we're ready to have that conversation and really ready to look at clients from a holistic point of view, I think maybe jumping ahead of that would do more harm than good, if that makes sense. Because what we don't want is a person to leave the office thinking something is wrong with me, or I'm questioning myself. I'm questioning, did that really happen? Am I crazy? So now I got a diagnosis because I experienced racism. So I think it has just to be done in a very nuanced way that I don't know if we're ready for as a profession.
Okay, thank you.
That was great. I have a question about one that was submitted. In the article in Counseling Today, it was going back to, I forget who mentioned it, but I think it was you, Dr. Hammond, about exhaustion, especially in the, in the Black community with this overwhelm. And you used a term called code switching. Or code switch. So can you talk a little bit about what that means? Any of you?
Absolutely. I think that probably a number of us on this call will have an experience of code switching. Code switching is essentially being aware of what the expectations are for your environment and who you are or what you represent as a person, and then trying to align how you present with the expectations of the environment. So as a quick example, working in a predominantly white institution, I may be, as a Black woman and a young professor of color, I may be more aware of showing up in a certain way on campus than I would at home. Like at home, my identity as a Black woman, I don't really think about it because it's just me. But when I walk on campus, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I recognize it right now, and I'm very aware of it. One example that I use to explain this again, or just another example, when I went on my interview to go for assistant professor, I was trying to figure out, how do I want to present here? How do I want to dress? How do I want to do my hair? That's a realistic consideration for a lot of people, because there are, I would say, culture-bound values around presentation. And particularly in some environments, that tends to be, whatever the European standard is for presentation. So I really struggled with, do I straighten my hair or not? Do I show up in a way that I believe they will perceive as more palatable? And that continues to be a struggle, but I think that at this point, I've just said, what you get, what you see is what you get. And if you don't accept the way that I present as just me, then perhaps the space that I'm in is not for me. But yeah, code switching is something I think we all experience in any number of just different ways. Perhaps realizing that when you're surrounded by all men, you might notice yourself behaving in a different way than you might when you're among other friends. Or just, I wonder if anyone else has another example of how you've code switched, or just Dr. Cartwright.
I have an example, and Dr. Avent Harris is going to laugh when I share this example. She probably already knows what I'm about to say. Dr. Avent Harris and I met, I think it was probably maybe 6 years ago. She lived in Texas at the time, and she was an assistant professor at one of the universities here. And she and I, we had interacted in all these professional circles, and you get the Angie that I give you. And depending on who you are, that's the Angie that you get. The four of you know, just based on our text thread, that we are very genuine with each other, but not all colleagues get to experience those realms of us. And so I remember the first time I sat down with Dr. Avent Harris outside of work, and she was like, oh my gosh, I actually like you. And she was like, this is not how you present professionally. I was like, no, of course it's not. You have to code switch. People don't, and that's how I felt at the time. I would say, as a starting out, a new assistant professor, not really understanding how people would accept me or not, and not knowing how I wanted to be in those spaces. The safest thing to do was just to present with the Angie who is strictly professional, who is eloquent when she speaks, and all of those things. And then you get to let your guard down. And so it's nice to be able to let your guard down and to really be who you are in professional settings. And that was mine and Dr. Avent Harris's. That was our first time actually becoming girlfriends, is we both got to let our professional code switching guard down.
Oh my gosh, Dr. Cartwright, you brought up something that was so important that I didn't say, safety there. I tend to think that really underlines why someone might code switch. And sometimes I've heard the question from students, is it a manipulation? No, it's not a manipulation. It's not the other person going out of their way to represent in a way to fool or in some way sell you. That's not really what it is. It's more of a means of protection on the person's part who is walking into the space that could feel threatening, that there's some power differential perhaps, or there's some clear systemic barrier that they're coming up against, and that's why they do it, right? We want to make sure that we are safe. So that story that you shared about yourself and Dr. Avent Harris, I think is such a great example, because when you're meeting someone new, regardless of if they share or it looks like they share a similar background as you or not, you're still kind of checking that person out. Like, can I trust them? So it's about trust too. Can I trust them to be my full self here in this space with this person? And once I unveil, that's the word I want to get to. Once I unveil myself, now that feels a little bit like really exposing all the pieces of who I am. And is that okay? Will you hold that against me? That's really what code switching is about.
Exactly.
I think that goes into, I saw the question pop up in the chat. I'm sorry, Allie, I didn't want to take your job, but it just kind of goes into the next question that the person asked about. Can we talk about the invisible labor, particularly for Black, Indigenous people of color women, and the exploitation and stressors on these women, and how we can better address this? And so even before we get to work, all these things that we've talked about have played into our mind. How are we going to wear our hair? How are we going to talk? How are we going to show up? How are we going to dress? When we're in a meeting and something offends us, like, do I respond? Like, do I do a knee-jerk response? How do I think about it so that I don't come off as angry, but I also want to be assertive? Like, all those things come before we even get to that invisible labor. I think that, in thinking about where we are, Dr. Cartwright has tenure, but thinking about on the tenure track, there are so many responsibilities that we have with teaching, research, and service. But there's the invisible labor of not only taking care of ourselves, taking care of our colleagues and peers, but then taking care of a lot of students who feel similarly and who come in our office and who need extra mentoring around some of these issues. And we don't get to put that on a CV. We don't get to say that, hey, I was writing, but this student came in, they needed me because they experienced this microaggression and they need to process that. Also, getting asked to do a lot of things around diversity and inclusion, both probably within your own program, but also on the university level, can be exhausting. And you have a lot of energy. For me, I have a lot of energy for this topic. And so it's about finding that balance between how do I need to take care of myself, and then how also can I make change and make influence. Dr. Crumb can probably speak a little bit about this, but we were hired at the same time, which I was like, oh my gosh, like both of us had natural hair and we like wanted to study these topics. I was like, wait, they hired us at the same time. So that was a really good thing because we had that support. And so a lot of our invisible labor probably is mitigated because we're able to support each other in some of those conversations and in some of those things. But I can imagine we do a lot of research in this area for people who may be the only person in their department, only person of color. It gets really, really stressful. And while I think there's been progress made, I think there's a lot more progress to go. Even in the Counseling Today article, I think it was there that I talked about, what do we consider even to be scholarship? For us, if we're talking about Black mental health, then it's important that we actually reach people in Black communities. And so that may not mean a journal article. It may mean actually going to a community center, partnering with a Greek organization, partnering with the church. That reaches and that makes more change in some ways for us than a journal article ever will. But then that's often sometimes invisible labor because it's not really counted in the same way. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think I'm getting clearer about who I am, about what my goals are, and just about what I want being a scholar to mean. So Dr. Crumb and I, our university is kind of like back home for us. And so to me, it would be disingenuous to come back home and not impact the spaces that helped raise me. Like, it doesn't make sense for me to get a PhD, go off, and then come back, and I'm just kind of secluded. So I've made a decision that's going to be an important part of my scholarship to do community engagement. And I've sought mentorship and collaboration about how to articulate that so that that labor is not invisible. So I think that's another part of it. It's like standing up for yourself, standing up for the work that you do so that it's not as invisible anymore.
Right.
Dr. Crumb, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add something about, in that same comment, how can we better address this exploitation and invisible labor? And in my doctoral training that was really focused on social justice and advocacy, they taught us to never go at it alone. And as Dr. Avent Harris shared, we naturally enter an environment in which they hired two Black women. But you find your co-conspirators, as Bettina Love refers, or other people refers to as allies. You look at the intersections, and they may not always intersect with color for those of you that may be the only person of color in your program. There were some times in my studies that the only person that I was in group with would be parents. Only people who would be my group partners were people with kids, because they understood when I had to get off the phone immediately. They understood the crying in the background. They wouldn't complain. And I say this this helps with persistence for anything that's a stressor to you, right? For anything, because what we've seen in recent research is that people look at students who are parents a little bit differently too, because they have that parental obligation, and they look at women who are parents differently too. So you find where your allies are, and you use that to lift some of the labor, right? You find that co-conspirator, you find that person, and you reach out to them at intersections. And there's actually research out there to support that that's a step in advocacy, is not to do it alone, because it will get exhausting. And if you can't find your peers, you start to reach out to your faculty, who should have an advanced level of understanding to support persistence and retention, and to help you build your personal identity and your counselor identity, which soon enough will grow hand in hand with more years of experience.
I just have one other thing to add before I move on, and it's something very personal to me in my own growth experience through all this, like learning to recognize the invisible labor, and it's learning to make it not invisible. So being okay with telling people, I'm doing this. I am doing this event today, and I posted about it. I am going out in my community. These are the things that I am doing because, quite frankly, all of us do really interesting things, and there's lots of other colleagues that I have who do wonderful things out in the field, but if no one will highlight that if I don't. Right? Who else is going to say to the department or to the general community, oh, Dr. H is doing this really cool thing, and here's how she's connecting all of these pieces, right? I don't have a publicist, right? I have to be my own publicist and not be afraid to kind of toot my own horn. I'm doing this, right? And for me, that was a big area of growth, perhaps maybe just my own personal socialization, and I wanted to just be like, oh, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. Yeah, and so what? I'm supposed to do it, and I am. So I'm going to tell you that I am. So no longer is it invisible. I can be bold and brave about sharing the things that I'm doing and talking about what's important to me, because no one else will.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for that commentary. We have someone who would like to speak. It's Ocean Eversley.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing this pertinent discussion. It is so refreshing. It's depressing, but it's also refreshing to hear, women of color speak about the truth, reality, and not sugarcoating it to be anything less than harsh, challenging, burdensome, and also provide solutions, okay? And maybe resilience, like to push forward the resilience that we all need to live in a racist society. I am a 62-year-old student at Springfield College. I'm in the School of Social Work, getting a master's degree. I had businesses for 30 years on Martha's Vineyard, decided to make a career change. I want to thank both Ms. Harris and Ms. Hammond for speaking about invisible labor. It's so important to have words to express your emotions and your feelings and your thoughts. And I never heard of the word invisible labor, and I'm going to use it from now on because I've been laboring since I was 7, the first time I was called the N-word, and it's exhausting. And, and what I find is, when we show up, wherever it is, in a professional setting or educational setting, we show up with this, for me, it's baggage, okay? This racist baggage that I've experienced all my life. And and I'm just saying this because it's good for me just to let it out, but it's just so when I go to school and I'm in class and people say, how you doing? And I answer, I'm just okay. Well, yeah, I have all my needs met. As far as financial or, I'm eating and I have clothes and I have housing, but there's this invisible labor that is so heavy. And like Ms. Hammond was saying, she's not going to sugarcoat, the truth. And I'm the type of person that I don't sugarcoat anything. Okay. And it's troublesome to hear about the DSM because I'm just learning all about the DSM, and I'm just wondering, who is like, if is there a board, or are there like a board of people that make these decisions? And I never even thought about that other countries might not even have a DSM. So that's very, informative to learn that there isn't even a DSM in other countries. And okay, so I know I'm going on, but I'm just letting it all out, like what's on my mind. And the next thing that, because I wanted to write a paper a couple years ago, how racism is a mental virus. And my white professor in another college said, you can't write that because it's not in the DSM. And I said, well, I really don't care if it's in the DSM or not. I know that racism is a virus because you can catch it. Okay. And there's a cure, and that's exposure to anti-racism philosophy, and people that are anti-racist. And the more you hang out with people that are more anti-racist, the likelihood that you're not going to have those same, racist thoughts and beliefs. So again, it's especially now because everything that's going on due to a racist president that pushes racism. I just feel that it as a student, it is overwhelming to do your work with this black cloud or this heavy white cloud of racism going on, surrounding me and in media and, just everything that's going on. If you just want to, I don't know if I asked a question. I know it was more of a statement, but that invisible labor was a very important word to put out. And if you have any other like words or expressions, I would appreciate it, because like I said, it's really important to be able to articulate your feelings.
Ocean, thank you for that feedback. It was very transparent, and I just want to commend you for sharing that with us. And But yes, I do agree that a lot of racism is a socialization process. I have this story that I shared last Friday. I dropped my 3-year-old African American son off to daycare, and a European American little white girl ran up to him. His name is Major, and she said, "Oh, Major, thank goodness you're here. It's going to be such a wonderful day. I love you so deeply." And about 4 or 5 parents just stopped and looked, and I know we all had the same thought for just a moment. Just a moment. If the world could be like that, that genuine, that loving. And he ran up to her and said, "I just love you, Emily. I love you." And it was just so heart wrenching because despite our differences, they only saw another human coming to school, right? And it's that simple, everyone. It's that simple. And then what I always tell my students in the social cultural classes and probably every other class that I teach, because this goes across the curriculum, not only in the social cultural class, is that you impact, this is a great place to start, impact what is your sphere of influence? I always tell them, you may not go and lead a protest, right? I may not make it to all the protests, but what is your sphere of influence? Somebody is listening to you. You're leading someone, right? So you model those behaviors. You be the change that you want to see every day. Everybody can do that. Everybody is capable. Everybody on that call is capable. And I always say that once I say that, you can't unhear those words from me. So now you have a task before you to be that change that you want to see, that positive change. So no matter what the ills of the world, as W.E.B. Du Bois says, that illness of America will always be racism. He said that way back then. I read the book years ago, and I hate to say it, but it still stands true. But what ills, how can you cure that ill? And sometimes it's with your own personal vaccination of positivity and education. And that's for everybody on the call. Thank you.
I would just add to Ocean, to echo what Dr. Crumb was saying, like about your transparency. And I think that when we embrace that with each other, that makes a huge difference. But we got to have a safe space to do that. And so, whatever sphere of influence that for anybody on the call that you have, I want to say authority over, that you have some sort of power over or influence over, to model what being authentic looks like and to create a safe space. I think the other thing is, like, it's taken me a lot of internal work to get to the place where I said, this is the scholar I want to be. This is the scholar I'm going to be, and I'm going to lean into that. And so that internal work was therapy. That internal work was my own spiritual practices. It was being honest with my colleagues and my peers on the days where I felt like, oh my gosh, like what have I gotten myself into? I'll never forget. So I am back to the hair conversation. I'm a full circle. Like I wear my hair any kind of way, and my colleagues know that. But I'll never forget, I had blonde braids over the summer, like jumbo braids too. And I had gone into the office, and I was doing some quick work. So I came back that fall. I want to say my hair was straightened that day or something. And one of the people who worked in the office said, "Oh, this is the Janee I know." And I was like, she was like, "I didn't recognize the other Janee." And so I realized then that people kind of paint this picture of you, and I was bold enough to say, like, however I wear my hair, I show up as Janee, and I'm okay with that. And I just, even those moments, it feels tough, Ocean. It feels like vulnerable. It feels like I'm exposing a part of myself. But for me, it's important that I'm like, this is who I am. This is how I show up. Now I called Dr. Crumb and was like, girl, I can't believe they just said it. But I had a safe space to process, and I kept doing my work. But it took a long time for me to get there, because previously I would have been like, oh, what do they think of me? Am I going to be qualified? Da, 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 da. But I've gotten to a place where it's just like, this is who I am. This is how I'm going to show up. And it helps other people. So for some reason, because I wear braids a lot, like students really respond to that. And so when I ask them to journal about a class, it never fails that somebody comments on how I wear my hair and how it helped them be more true to who they are. And so, I mean, I feel like I'm going on a tangent, but I think it's important that when you show up, you show up not with baggage. Yes, some baggage, but I also would reframe that and say, look, you show up with power. You show up with opportunity. You show up as a light to someone else to say, oh, she can do that. I can do that too.
Oh my gosh, Dr. Avent Harris, that's so important. Just the idea of showing up as you are and being okay with that. There's absolutely a risk in doing that. And I think the reward is one that you can reap as the person who's showing up and experiencing the freedom of just being who you are in whatever space you're in, but also for the next person who sees that and now feels more comfortable to show up as they are. And I linking it back to code switching, that's one of the reasons. I don't mean to make our discussion political, but I watched the vice presidential debate and how the difference in the feedback that Kamala Harris got from the way her facial expressions were showing up versus how Mike Pence, the feedback he got, and it was like night and day. And so I think it's very difficult to show up in that space, or one can assume it was very difficult for her to show up in that space exactly who she was, because she was probably trying to calculate how much of myself can I show here. And at the same time, I think sometimes we just have to go for it and say, this is what you're going to get, because how are we ever going to create any type of change if we keep doing this, if we keep staying stuck in the same cycle where I'm not showing you all of who I am and I'm not hiding, but you know what I mean. I am being very protective of these pieces because of this work environment. And it just it creates a space where the people in power, the people who get to say what's okay, what is professional, what's not, what fits here, it just makes it so they can keep doing that. And I don't want to be part of that. I want to be part of the person who says, you know what, if y'all want me here, this is what you're going to get. And yeah, I recognize that there's a certain privilege in that, because not everyone can do that, and you can't do that in every space, but find your own power. What feels okay to do when, and how can you do that? How can you steal little bits of little windows where you can show them who you are? And I think my hope is, anyway, that slowly over time we'll see movement and just being able to show up in your full self wherever you are. And so I'm not just speaking to Ocean here, but just all of us on this call. How can we make it safe for everyone to do that?
That is my hope too, as a woman, being able to have those spaces. But thank you, Ocean, for utilizing this brave space. We appreciate you and all of the commentary that followed. We have a question in the chat from Kaden. It says, you guys have mentioned some counselors, therapists who believe that racism and trauma don't exist. How would you go about someone who has had that experience, maybe multiple times, being told their struggles don't exist from other mental health experts?
Okay, so I saw this comment come up in the chat, and one of the first things that came to mind for me is Facebook. And the reason why Facebook came to mind for me is because I don't recall, ladies, I don't recall if it was when our podcast was released or if it was our Counseling Today article, but we were on our text thread, and it may have even been a FaceTime group chat call, and we were reading some of the comments that counselors who are members of the American Counseling Association, counselors who are providing mental health services, we were reading some of the comments that they were making about race, that they were making about broaching, that they were making about politics. And we were having this conversation about, oh my goodness, these people are probably doing more harm than good. And so it amazes me that people they feel like they have this cloak of invisibility on Facebook, and they just say what they want and not necessarily realize the impact. But on the other hand, I thank them and welcome those things, because it really helps me to understand that this kind of thing really is real. Like, these are my colleagues that I'm sitting with at professional conferences. These are my colleagues that my students are interacting with. So what can I do to mitigate some of the damage? So I think from the professional counselor standpoint, as a colleague, I think it's important to call out racism, to call out biases, but to do it in a way where your message can be received. And this is my own, anybody who knows me can tell you, this is my personal work, that and it is my lifelong journey. Sometimes I get so passionate that my message gets lost in the delivery. And so I think making sure that you deliver your messages in a way where they can be heard. And we think about a push-pull approach. When you're giving somebody feedback or when you're presenting information that's this sensitive, it's really important to lend personal stories, to lend professional stories so that you can pull them in instead of pushing them away. So I think the pull in versus the push approach is really important. Now, on the clinical side of things, my hope for our clients is that they aren't experiencing those things in counseling, but I know for a fact they are. And so I think that is, we have to repair that. There's damage repair that has to be done. There has to be some reaffirmations that, yes, this is your experience. You're not making this up. Not only is this your experience, it's my experience too. It's the experience of lots of other people. And so I think it's important to do some damage control when those clients come into our offices. It has happened to me where clients say, oh, my counselor, the last counselor I had said this. And I can hear some of the microaggressions. I can hear some of the oppression, some of the discrimination. And so it's repair. It's repair and education.
Excellent. Thank you. We have Dr. Lindsay Fulmer has her hand up. Go ahead.
I'm going to try this. Sorry, I have my 3-month-old on me. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm okay. Okay. Thank you. Double duty today. So my question is regarding politics in the classroom. So oftentimes there's sort of a difference of opinion, at least in students that I've worked with, about whether or not politics need to enter the classroom or how much that needs to impact us as counselors. And so, Dr. Cartwright, I know you're in Texas, and I'm sure you're aware of the law that was just passed maybe 2 weeks ago that social workers are now allowed to discriminate and refuse services to folks with disabilities, and also in the LGBTQ community. And so I say that because we have some social work students and faculty represented here. So my question, I guess, is, you know, we know that the experience of disability and being a member of the LGBTQ community is vastly different for folks of color. And so what is the responsibility that counselors, psychologists, and social workers have in advocating for and addressing policies that are being implemented like this? And what would you all say in terms of the political shift that we're in right now and the importance of that entering the classroom and having conversations around that?
Ooh, Lindsay, that is a loaded question. I think you probably saw all of us go, okay. The safest way that I have been able to do it is to always bring these discussions back to our guiding documents for our profession. So what do, for example, because I'm a counselor, what are the American Counseling Association, what does it say about advocacy and how that is part of our role? And then try to make a link to some of the things that are happening and present those as advocacy opportunities, rather than to make a case for moral connections. A lot of the the research about advocacy tends to say it's harder to change people's minds if you only look at trying to sell them on what's right. But in order to make a long-lasting change, first we have to go with what can you do, right? What are the ethical or legal things that we have to that there's already a basis for, and then stick to that first. And that seems to be an easier way into these types of discussions, rather than just saying this is wrong and this is why. Because I can't change people's minds if that's what they think, but if they're going to be in our field, for example, this is how their behavior will be viewed, and this is why it will be unacceptable.
Go ahead, Dr. Harris.
I was going to add, I mean, I'll never forget one of my colleagues when we first started out, he would say, being a counselor is a choice. And when you choose to be a counselor, there are things that you choose then to engage with, because we engage with humans. And so to say that we can't talk about politics or we can't talk about these issues would be counter to who we are, because what's going to happen when our clients come in the office? And I always try to connect it back to clients, because that feels a little safer to have the conversation. It's like, so if a client came into your office and they wanted to talk about what's going on, how then would you respond? Would you say, oh no, I can't talk about that because it's political? No, it's going to be some very real emotional, mental reactions, no matter what happens with the election, right? And so we gotta be comfortable start. If we don't, and it goes back to the question before, a lot of the ways we repair this damage is within counselor education, because we as counselor educators need to take responsibility and across the curriculum have these hard conversations, so that it's just not one class that's talking to you about social culture. It's, you get this in your diagnosis class, you get this in your intro class. And I'm sure you would agree similar with social work. So that's kind of how I say it. And I say we don't operate in a vacuum. And that we're having these conversations now, so that when you get in front of a client, it won't be the first time that you are confronted with some of these hard issues. And I'll never forget one of my, I think it was the first year I was a counselor educator. It was when the Michael Brown incident happened, and we had a student do a presentation. And I mean, the class like erupted, like people walked out. I was like, oh my God, oh my God. But I came back the next week and I was like, let's process what happened. Because what happens if you get a client who wants to talk about this, and are you just gonna walk out then? So that would be my answer. But it's hard. And sometimes you go, especially when I teach social culture classes, I go home with this like uneasiness, like every day, every night after class, like, oh my God, like, did I just say something that's gonna get me fired or something? But I think it's important.
Yeah. It's a very real experience, Lindsay. I remember my first year or two, and I was teaching theories, not even social cultural, and I think Hillary Rodham Clinton was running for president. And there were some women students who did not believe women should be in leadership. They got up, they walked out of class. And I mean, I'm a person that I definitely respect differences. I do, right? We're diverse. However, people are going to have their own views. Socialization is a deep process. And I believe in doing no harm. If you feel like even if you're a social worker, if you're a counselor, whatever profession you are, if you feel like your views are so stiff, be courageous enough not to provide that client services and to provide a referral. That is the reason why there are so many people in your program. That's the reason why there are so many people. We're putting out great counselors and therapists and social workers. Find another one. Find another one. You are not stuck with one, no matter what. And now look at telehealth and teletherapy. That opens our options up more. So before any clinician is so stuck in their own views to do harm, just find another one. I know I would. And once you find that client and counselor relationship, that therapeutic alliance, and you build that trust, then you'll be set on the path to positive change. But I hope that no one is ever stuck with someone that they can't be their whole self with. And that's what we teach.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. And I noticed in the chat that Dr. Rowland mentioned that there are several important things about cultural competence, but what Dr. Rowland mentioned specifically is that cultural competence is a lifelong learning event. And that is so very true. You know, I really, really, really try to drive home the point that cultural competence occurs on a continuum. It's not a yes or no kind of thing. And the more you move along that continuum, the more you realize you don't know as much as you thought you did. So you never really get to that destination. It's always a journey. It is a lifelong journey. And so it's not a yes, I'm culturally competent. No, I'm not. It is development. It's a journey. And, you know, I challenged myself this year. My challenge was to learn more about Native American and indigenous people. And so even if I feel like I know something, we can always know more. Challenge yourself about a particular topic, a particular group of folks, a particular group of people to learn more, and challenge your students to do the same. Challenge yourself. You have to challenge yourself.
All right, great. We have another question in the chat. This is from a faculty member. tips in how, as faculty, they can help provide best learning environments to help those cope with racial trauma they have may experienced in other courses or in academia as a whole.
Gosh, this is a tough one. And I mean, it's all tough. I find this one to be difficult for me because I want to support my colleagues as much as I can. You know, so it is tough when students come to you and they talk about the microaggressions that perhaps they experienced in a class. When they share macroaggressions that they've experienced, and it's almost, how do I support my colleagues as an educator, but also support my student? And the more that I have become comfortable with myself as an advocate and as a person, and sharing pieces of myself more so now than I used to, I find myself just trying to be as genuinely authentic with my students as I can be by sharing, you know, like, hey, if someone said this to you, then that's not okay. And these are the things that you can do to initiate those conversations, or this is how I can come alongside you and help you initiate some of these conversations while still having conversations with my colleagues about, you know, so if this happens, perhaps this is another way we can respond. Again, I think it's that that pull in versus the push out approach that's really important. But I do find myself really navigating this space carefully because as faculty, I can speak for my department. We want to be a unified front. We really want to support each other. And we want to be able to say, hey, we're all on the same page here. And in actuality, we're all in different places on that continuum. So I feel like part of my journey is to help my colleagues along the way, but to more so support my students.
Here's where using power and privilege can really be helpful. So for our colleagues who have or identify from a majority group or population, to set a tone that we will not tolerate this, because it can be really vulnerable when you're the person of color coming to another faculty member saying, hey, I had a student of color come to me and say da 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 da, like it's like a double vulnerability, I think. And so just setting an expectation across the department. So if you're a department chair, if you're a program coordinator, to say our program will be this and it won't be that, really, really helps set the tone. And students can pick up on things really quickly. Like they pick up on the vibe of a department. They know when something is not tolerated or when something is tolerated. And so I think that that's helpful. It's back to what Dr. Crumb said about Patina Love, co-conspirators, like people who will kind of get there in the game with you. And I mean, that even starts from a basic of, we're not only going to regulate cultural topics to the multicultural class, like putting the expectation on your department that every single class will have a component of that. Little things like that can really help set the tone so that one person doesn't feel like they're alone or they're the only one that a student can go to, right? So a student may feel like, oh, Dr. Avent Harris is the only one I can go to because she's the only one that looks like me. It's like, no, I had this other professor who maybe doesn't look like me, but I can tell where they stand on issues. I can go to them as well. So.
And talking about, and as the faculty, talking about this in your program meetings, we do it all the time. And the position statements that came out, it was before George Floyd. It was the young man in Georgia. What was his name? Ahmaud Arbery, right. Mm-hmm. Dr. Avent Harris and I were not the people. We were on the grounds doing the cultural healing groups. But our European American colleagues took a stance and they said, let us work on the statement. Let us connect with the students while you all do the work in the community. And that's what it takes. We were a united front. They were speaking to the students. They took what we talked, the talking points and our book recommendations from there and gave it to the students as a resource. But they didn't wait and say, well, now that since you all are finished with the cultural healing group, can you draft a statement for the program as the 2 Black women in the program? They didn't do that. They went ahead and did their part. And that's exactly what Dr. Avent Harris is talking about. Everybody being united front. So when the students get those messages, it's everyone together. And when students make sexist or racist remarks in their papers during their clinical work, we talk about it. We don't hide it under the paper where it was the white faculty, so it's okay if I say this about Black children. No, you confront it. We talk about it in a program meeting and we meet with the student, okay? Because our children, and remember school-based, school counseling, all children need to be safe behind closed doors with you. And we take that very seriously. So we are a united front on those type of matters.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. I love that idea of the united front and understanding that we can play different roles to attack one purpose. That's fantastic. Janee Lewis has a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you all saw it. While keeping in mind the need some of us feel to code switch while in academia, how do you also manage to make these conversations accessible to the broader Black community in ways that they can name? Because I'm a firm believer in Black people understanding that racism affects them, just how overwhelmingly impactful racism is to our health while aiding them and providing them the resources to survive and be holistically healthy.
Y'all want me to take this one since I go to the churches a lot?
Yeah, and talk about social media too.
Oh, yes. Okay. Can you still hear me? Because I think I hit a button. Okay. So, Janee, first of all, I love your name. Second of all, I think that this goes back to what I was saying before about being able to articulate in a way of like what you're doing. So how you describe impact, how you articulate impact is very, very important. So what I do is I may write an article, right, publish it so I can have that piece of the academia. But then for me, it is maybe, like I said, going to a church, doing a training, going to do a presentation, post it on social media. So I get the most hits about, I mean, I probably have like my citation count is up or my viewers is up because like when I do an article, I then post it and I put a caption of like how it is in language that, hold on one second, baby, in language that the community can understand. And so then I get questions or I get inboxes and then I get like, oh, well, can you come talk to this group? And so I think it's really important to share what we do in this kind of secluded space in ways that people who we love, who we work with, who we may interact with, who we may go to the grocery store with, who we go to church with, can understand, because that's where real change happens. Partnering with a community stakeholder so that you can still maintain some of that academic work while also reaching community. So really figuring out who in the community you're trying to reach, who's that gatekeeper, who is that person who has that influence. For me, a lot of times, I know I said it before, but it's pastors. Like I did a video one time with a pastor. That's probably the best thing I ever done. Like people play it in clinical sessions, but we talked about mental health from both of our perspectives. And it was so relatable to people that it just really kind of took off and people were able to use it in multiple ways. And so I think kind of being creative in that. So in my, when I write up like kind of like my annual reports, I talk about this is what a practitioner scholar looks like. This is what research on the ground looks like. This is how I'm implementing what I'm saying I'm going to do in these articles. So those are just a couple of ways. And I think giving people language to use in communities helps them be an advocate for themselves, helps them know what to look for when they're looking for a therapist, to Dr. Crumb's point. So sharing some of the work that we've done, and then they had the language to go to a therapist and say, okay, so tell me a little bit about how you work multicultural competence into your approach or something like that. I think all those things are very, very important. I also think part of it is representation matters. I know I said it before, but they see me, and I'm back in where I kind of grew up. So they see me as Janee from back in the day, who now has this new identity. And so there's a kind of a trust factor there in some ways. And so they're like, wow, like, you know, Janee saying like mental health is good. Like, I'm gonna just like look into this. So don't underplay the fact, hold on one second, because my child is here. Don't downplay the opportunity you have by just showing up in those communities as well.
And to add to that, you know, it's really important that when we are disseminating information, that it is presented in a way where it's accessible. And so You know, we could publish articles in top journals, and the only folks who have access to that are folks who are in academic settings where they can go to a library and download things from EBSCOhost and JSTOR and all those things. Those are not the things that are necessarily going to directly impact the communities we serve. So it's so very important that we present things in a way that are accessible. So some things earlier, I'm not sure if you heard, Dr. Crumb mentioned social media. So putting things on social media, making things shareable. I'd like to, unfortunately, Dr. Hammonds, I'm kind of going to put you on the spot here. Dr. Hammonds had a post on Facebook that went viral and has been translated into so many different languages because she posted something on Facebook. So Dr. Hammonds, could you speak a little bit about that? Sorry for putting you on the spot.
And this is Dr. Cartwright saying this is a moment to share what you've done. So I appreciate that. For me, we were talking about what power do you have? I think Dr. Avent Harris said that earlier. What skills do you have? What's within your realm of your scope of impact? And one of the things that I did over the summer as everything was starting to change and I felt like my life was just different in so many ways and I had so many different emotions around that, I found a way to channel those thoughts using the skill set that I have with research, through that clinical lens. And I started just writing things. And so I wrote poems, I recorded sort of like spoken word essays, and I put them to I made videos of these things. I had a viral post that I related trauma to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that was shared millions of times and commented on. I actually got a spot on the news. Like there was lots of ways that one thing just mushroomed outward, and it was a really unique and very cool experience. That this is what that scholar practitioner role looks like, sharing what I know about trauma and giving it in a way that's accessible. That also led to a spot on NPR and just sharing a little bit about race-based trauma after the pandemic first hit. And there's so many things that you can do with just finding a way to share your research or what you know, the skills that you have, in an easily accessible manner. And I found that social media is a great place to do that because it's free and it's open access and so many people can find it. And I completely agree. I think it was Dr. Cartwright who said, the people who are searching or Googling mental health information, they're not going to come upon a JSTOR article, or they're not going to be able to access anything on EBSCOhost. So what can they find? Right? And start there. Mm-hmm.
Yes, let's use social media for good. That's amazing. I didn't know how famous you were. Thank you for being here. We're humbled in your presence. Dr. Jacqueline has a question. Her hand is raised.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello, your mic is live. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for having this event. I am retired with a background in higher ed administration, but a calling to psychology, religion, and spirituality. And looking at the issue of racial differences, while there are similarities, and very often in academia, there's that, quote, lumping of groups into people of color. And yet there are some specificities and particularities that exist within groups. How do you speak to that in the 21st century? And I must give myself away to say I'm from the 20th century.
Well, I think it's really important to, we hear people say people of color or underserved populations, and that's wonderful if that is the work that you do. But if you are working in Black communities, say Black communities. If you're working in Latinx communities, say Latinx communities. And so I think it's really important as scholars, as practitioners, as educators, that we recognize underserved groups, but then also that we recognize the groups within those underserved populations. I'm not quite sure, Dr. Jacqueline, if that answers part of your question, but I do think it's important to identify the underserved groups that you're working with and not just lumping everybody into one category and saying, oh yeah, underserved populations. Well, which underserved populations? Just because something works typically for Black communities doesn't mean that that is going to work for every other underserved group.
Yeah, and that's what I find. I'm in the 5 College area, and I find that for institutional expediency, I think and for economic expediency in institutions especially, it's easy enough to set up programs. And today's program that was specific, I commend you highly for being willing to take that leap of faith and speak to the realities that exist among us, even though there are realities that bring us together.
Thank you.
So
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Unfortunately, we're coming close to the end of our time, but we do have a couple of more questions. A private message was sent saying, Dr. Crumb mentioned cultural community group counseling. When working with people of color in these groups, what does this group work consist of, and what resources do you use to run these groups?
As far as our cultural healing groups, for example, this summer there was a lot going on with police brutality in Black America, and there was a lot of racism that became present in the workplaces, right with your colleagues who sit in the next cubicle, that people were outing each other, people were posting things on social media, and these people were supervisors, and their employees were not okay with coming back to work knowing that these people had posted disparaging messages. And so we partnered with the Office of Equity and Diversity at our university and a couple of senior professors who had tenure. And we hosted cultural healing groups that were specifically for African Americans. And we talked about what they felt like, and we gave them voice. And I was the moderator, and Dr. Avent Harris was the co-moderator, and she worked the group chat. And there was a lot of hurt. There was a lot of fear. And the resource that we used was the Racial Healing Handbook by Dr. Annalie Singh, who is a leader in our field, as well as the field of psychology in racial healing. And I put a lot of questions and resources from there. And the first session is about listening. And we held this session twice already, because you just don't hold a group like that and never follow up with people, right? You want that continuation. And although this was not therapeutic, it was just a brave space. What we would call an affinity group. Affinity group is when the people in that group share specific characteristics together. And everything we do is very research-based, just in case anybody ever challenges us. We know what we're doing, we know what we're talking about. So we held that affinity group. A lot of questions was pulled from that handbook. And the first session was really about listening, and there was a lot of fear and a lot of anger, and they got a time to really share and expose their feelings. So I would say that is a good place to start with that type of cultural group, cultural-based specific group.
And I would just add back to Janee's point, that's a good opportunity to introduce some of that language. I hate to say clinical language, but that clinical language that people may not have, that gives verbiage to what they're feeling. And I think a lot of people left that group empowered. You can also think about when life goes back to, I don't want to say normal, but however life goes back, where you host these groups. So ours was virtual given COVID, but really being intentional about seeking collaboration so that you can host these groups in places that already feel safe for people. So whether it be churches, whether it be their community centers, things like that, people really can connect to, and I found they're more likely in some ways to show up.
And I'll post that book. I'm trying to post it in the chat if anybody wants to reference it.
I noticed the question from Katrina in the chat about white savior syndrome and navigating spaces with our white counterparts. I think it is very, it's a challenging space, and I think it's really important that we have those conversations. I think there's a balance between, am I frozen? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry, I was going to say, I think I might be frozen. I think there's a balance between lifting and sharing some of that load than white savior. And so I think it's having those critical conversations where our colleagues, yes, if they're saying, hey, I want to be able to step in and lift some of this load and carry some of this, so you don't feel like because you're a Black woman, you have to do it, versus white savior. And so I think sometimes folks are well-intentioned, but perhaps their intentions are not delivered in ways where it's best received. And so I think just having those conversations, allowing and extending grace to each other, so that way when those things come up, they feel safe enough to say, okay, I want to help, and you also feel safe enough to say, I can appreciate you wanting to help, and also this is how it may be perceived.
I would also say, I don't know whether it's being pregnant and having like a lot less energy, but I've become a lot better at drawing boundaries and saying like, okay, yes, we can work on this together, but it's not my job, nor do I have the energy, nor the emotional bandwidth right now to teach anybody about racism, to teach anybody about all these things. Here's some resources that may help you. I'm happy to help process some of this at some times, but I think you have to be really clear in your own boundaries too, when you have the mental bandwidth. So to Dr. Crumb's point, I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to write a statement. Yes, I thought it was important. Yes, I thought our students needed it, but I wasn't there. So I'm glad that in the time where I needed someone to come along as a counterpart, it wasn't a situation where it's like, well, can you help teach us how to do this? It was like, no, they did the research, they made the statement, they sent it to us to review, they put it out, which was really, really helpful. And so I think it's important, I would say, to our white counterparts and white allies and co-conspirators to really be mindful of that when you are approaching your Black colleagues, particularly given this climate that we're in. What can I do before I even step to you and say, this is something that I want to work on? How can I be well informed?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Great information all around. And I know we just have a few minutes left, but I'd like to close if each one of you could just quickly give a small call to action. I know, everybody wants to do something. And like you said at the beginning, small steps lead to bigger steps, and it's better than doing nothing anytime. So if each of you could just maybe suggest one small step we as counselors can take that could possibly lead to bigger things.
Okay, I'll go ahead and lead, and it really follows up with something that I mentioned. Be the change that you want to see. Think about what I shared about your sphere of influence. It may be your parents, it may be your grandparents, it may be your children, but educate them on what you learned today. Educate them, because being a part of these type of environments is a privilege. Use your privilege for power to create the changes that you want to see regarding equity.
I think for me, it's somewhat twofold. First, I'd like to see folks extend grace to themselves, grace to be who you are, to be authentic, and to do that in a level that feels comfortable for you, and knowing and understanding that what you know today, you'll know 10 times more in the future. And so not feeling guilty about what you don't know right now. And then because of that, I would encourage you to think of an area of growth and to challenge yourself. Challenge yourself about something that you're uncomfortable with, something that you're unfamiliar with and about, and learn and grow. So know that it's okay for you to not know everything, and then do something about it.
Very similar to Dr. Cartwright, I was going to say learn and act. So challenge yourself, check in, do some self-reflection, and figure out what are those areas that perhaps you have blind spots, or you're less familiar with, or less comfortable with, recognizing that we all have them and that's okay. So whatever those areas are, do some of your own learning, and don't wait for someone else to mandate that for you. So you don't have to just stick to what you are learning in your courses, or what other people tell you to read. Go out and do your own research and find those books, podcasts, whatever it is. Dig into the literature and get the information for yourself, because no one else can do that for you. And then make the connections. Act as well. Now with the new information that you have, how can you change your system? How can you think about making sure that the system that you are a part of is more welcoming, more open to people who, well, just of all backgrounds, of all experiences. So I would say in closing there, learn and act, and make sure you know that it's your responsibility to do it.
Dr. Hammonds took what I was going to say, but I would say there's so many books out there now that can help you, that are accessible outside of what we may read in our classrooms. But I would say when we say act to, it can look like little small things. So one of the most powerful things you could do is, like, in the moment, if you hear something racist, you hear a colleague being attacked, say something then. A lot of times people wait till the meeting's over and be like, oh my God, I can't believe that person said something. And I'm like, well, you could have helped me out and said something during the meeting. So it's like little bitty steps like that can lead to great change. I would also say, when you feel that defensiveness coming up, for whatever it is, like, lean into that. Don't be afraid of that, and work through that, because a lot of times we just stop at when we feel defensive, when we feel attacked, or we feel like something is like going against what we've always known. But lean into that.
Yes, and I think the first time you do it is hard, and then the next time it's a little bit easier, and the next time it's a little bit easier, and then you're an advocate. So you have to, I know it's oversaid, but get comfortable with being uncomfortable. But we do have to go. I can't thank you all enough. Dr. Crumb, Dr. Hammonds, Dr. Avent Harris, and Dr. Cartwright, thank you so much for your time. It's so appreciated, for sharing your knowledge here. You have made a big change today for us, and we in turn can now go out and do great things because you've helped us along that path. So we appreciate you so much. And this has been recorded, so we will be able to share it, and maybe we could give it to Dr. Hammond so it'll go viral, and we can all be famous like her. So thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.